It was the first major battle for Canadians in the Great War, and their courage and bravery left its mark on a Belgian battlefield. Joining us now to reflect on the battle and its meaning, Mélanie Morin-Pelletier, First World War historian at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, and Alan Boker. He is a historian, former diplomat, and author of A Time Such as There Never Was Before, Canada After the Great War. Nice to have you two here for what is, to be sure, a solemn anniversary of a war that the battle of which we're going to be discussing started 100 years ago next week. And let's put a little history on the screen before we start here. The First Battle of Ypres, if you would, please, Sheldon, was October 19th to November 22nd, 1914, but we are going to remember the Second Battle of Ypres, which started April 22nd, 1915, and went until May 25th, 1915. That was Canada's part in it. It was fought by the 1st Canadian Division, together with other British Empire forces, the French and Belgian armies. It was the first time poison gas was used in war. The Germans released 160 tons of chlorine gas on Allied troops. More than 2,000 Canadians died. 4,500 Canadians were wounded or captured. In the end, there were 70,000 Allied casualties and 35,000 German casualties. Ypres, as we need to remember, is in Belgium, in the southwestern part of the country, near the border with France. And Mélanie, let's start by asking why, in your view, it was so important to the overall war effort.
It had a logistical significance because, as you said, it was close to the coastal port, so it was important to bring troops, to bring war supply. But it also had a major emotional significance for the Allied because they had lost over 60,000 soldiers in the First Battle of Ypres, so they wanted to hold to Ypres with dear life. It was the last major Belgian city in Allied hands.
What would you add to that, Alan, about why it's so historically significant?
I think the impact of the battle on the people at home, that it was reported as a glorious victory. And these untried Canadian troops, nobody knew how Canadian troops would perform in battle. They were the first sort of levies, if you like, who were not professional soldiers going into battle. And there was a great concern that these undisciplined colonials would not hold. And in fact, when the reports started coming in to the newspapers in Canada in April after the battle, they were laudatory. The Canadians had held the line, saved the day, at great sacrifice. And this, I think, created a feeling of patriotism, a legend, if I can use that word in its correct context, of the Canadian soldiers who had shown exemplary bravery. And it turned at home as the casualty lists came in, because that was the next act. First, you had the reports of the bravery. Then, and only then, after a period of a couple of weeks, telegram after telegram after telegram descends on Canadian homes in the large cities. And suddenly the cost of this battle is apparent. And so what had been an adventure is now a war, and what was a war would become a crusade.
Well, to that end, how prepared do you think Canadian troops were for what they found themselves in the midst of overseas?
I think that they had basic training in Canada and in England. By the time they were on the Western Front in February and then in April, they knew about trench warfare, but they would really have their baptism of fire at Ypres. So they were still fresh troops.
A baptism of fire.
Absolutely.
How was this war different than other wars, Alan, that Canadian troops participated in prior to World War I?
Well, the most obvious one in terms of this battle is the casualty level. 6,000 casualties out of 18,000 people who've been sent in the 1st Division to France. This is an appalling number. I don't know what multipliers you have to use to translate this into contemporary figures.
Well, think about it. In Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan,
we lost 160 soldiers?
Yeah, we'd be thinking, if we have 4 times the population now that we did then, you'd be thinking in terms of 600 or 700 people at that time. Instead, you're talking 25,000 people killed in a single battle over the course of 2 days.
And this is not to minimize the sacrifice made by our soldiers in Afghanistan now, but
Absolutely.
it puts things, it puts it into a wholly different perspective, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's something that we've never experienced before.
You talked about trench warfare, and this was, this is a whole new level of appalling when it comes to warfare, right? Just describe what that was like for the troops.
It was horrific. When the Canadians took the trenches in April 1915, just before the Second Battle of Ypres, the condition of the trenches were appalling. It was filthy. It was not the system that would later become, they needed to live in the trenches. It was basically digging a hole in the soil, and they would have to live in there for years. It was cold, it was wet, in the summer it was very hot, and it was open, so the fire would come at all times, so it was very difficult to adapt.
You keep hearing this expression, there were rats the size of cats.
Yeah.
I've heard that before.
And that they were living like rats in sewers, and that's exactly true.
Now, from a tactical perspective, the Allies or the Germans, who actually had the advantage in your view?
During the Second Battle of Ypres, I think that the gas had a big impact in that battle per se. It was a surprise. The Allies had heard about the possibility of gas being used, but they couldn't picture what that would look like or how to protect themselves from it. So I think in that sense, the Germans had an advantage on April 22nd at least, yeah.
We're going to put a picture up now. We want to warn everybody, this is war. Go ahead, let's put that picture up. Alan, they used chemical weapons, even though there was an international prohibition against using chemical weapons. Why did the Germans do that?
Well, in one way, because they could. The Germans had a very active chemical industry. They were world leaders in dyes and so on. Another is that the war wasn't going particularly well for Germany. They had defeated the Russians, but the Russians were pushing back. The Austrians were collapsing. They had failed to knock France out of the war. The British were now there in strength. And I think there was a feeling on the part of the generals that they had to do something dramatic to turn this thing around. There was a lot of controversy in the German command about this. Whether it's more terrible to use poison gas in a war as opposed to artillery shells that blow people to marmalade, I don't know. Mm-hmm. But the one was deemed to be okay and the other was not.
Did they not appreciate the fact that if the wind changed direction, they were going to basically gas themselves?
Well, this is why they had to be very careful using it, and why in the long term it wasn't a very good thing for them to do, because the wind blows west to east more often than it blows east to west. So they had to wait for an ideal time. But in terms of the perception of the war, too, what the gas did is it reinforced the impression in Canadians, the propaganda of the beastly Hun. And this, of course, had been already a major propaganda tool of the Allies, the rape of nuns, the burning of the library at Louvain, and so on. And now here are these barbarians at it again. So Canadians have not only stood up bravely against an enemy, they have fought bestiality, they fought barbarism. And this theme of the war as a total war of civilization against barbarism would be an important element of the Canadian war effort.
There was a piece of disinformation in there too, right? I mean, someone on our side said they even crucified one of our soldiers. There was a rumor going around. Turned out not to be true, right?
Well, yes, shortly after the battle, a number of Canadian soldiers reported that they had seen a Canadian sergeant crucified to a barn door with bayonets through his hands and feet. And many different people said they saw this. British troops said they saw it. The barn door became a fence post and so on. Some said a British soldier. No one could ever quite track this down, but it was a persistent rumor, and it lasted all through the war. And it would have repercussions if we have time to get to it. It would have repercussions after the war as well. But again, this is another example of German barbarism. At the time, there were questions asked in the British House of Commons. The Canadian military authorities
But to
investigated.
confirm, there's no evidence that it actually happened.
There was at the time no evidence it actually happened. A scholar in Britain has actually produced evidence now saying that it did happen.
Huh.
If it did happen, it would have been just one barbaric element in what was in fact a very barbaric battle. This
Sure.
was a fiercely fought battle.
Well, that's the other thing I want to get to. How is it that Canadian soldiers could have been gassed and yet held the line? How did they do that?
It took a lot of courage, but also on April 22nd, the gas went mostly on the French troop, on the left flank of the Canadians. So yes, they saw the French soldiers running, coughing, dying. It was horrific, but they were spared. Some of the Canadians were touched, but not as much as the French. So they decided, despite seeing all of this chaos, and that they would hold the line, and they did. And they did for a few days after that. They counterattacked in horrific situation.
How did the battle end?
For the Canadian infantry, it ended they were replaced on April 25th. And so they hold the line, and they kept it until reinforcement was brought on the 25th. So it was an important time that they were there for the 4 days. They kept the line, and then they got some help.
Can you say that anybody decisively won or lost that battle?
It was pretty much statu quo, and it was very costly in life.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing is, keeping Ypres for the Allied meant that they would have to defend it for many years to come.
Were there any reporters present to tell people back in Canada what was going on?
That's an interesting story. The answer is, in terms of reporters and media, no. There was total press censorship. Reporters, cameras, and so on were not allowed at the front. The British did allow one person whom they called an eyewitness. And so the initial reports were all from the British War Office. But there's an interesting sidebar to that. A Canadian, Max Aiken, Sir Max Aiken by then, had himself appointed, he had made a fortune in the merger mania in Canada, and while still in his 20s, went to Britain in 1910, made a further fortune, got himself a knighthood, got himself elected to the House of Commons, and when the war broke out, he convinced his Canadian friends to let him set up something called the Canadian War Records Office, whose job it would be to produce documents and pictures and so on, and he exploited that all through the war brilliantly for propaganda. But he got himself appointed the Canadian eyewitness. And so he was the only sort of non-military person near the Ypres front during this battle. He didn't go up to the front, he collected information behind. But his reports, beginning May 1st, were graphic, brilliantly written, and
Accurate?
I would say probably. I mean, they were. He reported accurately the Canadian senior officers who were killed, which the British would never have done.
But mostly our people back home are getting news, I guess, of this battle from returning troops?
To some degree, but the troops aren't returning, really. There are some letters home and a few things
Right.
like that, but they're
Okay.
censored. The wounded soldiers are sent, they're treated at the front, then they're sent to Britain. So there's the beginning of a flow of, Melanie, you know this better than I do, I guess, but I don't think there are really a lot of wounded Canadian soldiers coming back right away.
Right away.
Yeah.
I would say that a lot of the news came from the newspapers.
Yes.
As you know.
And Max Aiken's dispatches, again, this theme of these gallant Canadians who've saved the day. He had his reasons for this, and the British had their reasons for that. They wanted to extol the Canadians because they wanted to build an empire that would be composed of autonomous dominions, the cubs, the lion's cubs coming to the defense of the mother country and so on. So this was good grist for a whole lot of different mills.
Well, that gets to one of my next questions, which is, Canada may or may not have had any direct national security interests in the middle of Europe in 1915. So why are we there anyway?
We're there because when the British Empire joined the war in 1914, Canada was at war. But
So Britain decided to go to war, and therefore we were in too.
exactly,
Did our parliament make a separate declaration of war?
not in 1914.
Only in World War II?
Yes,
So Mother Country came calling, and we answered the call.
exactly.
Simple as that.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of discussion, of course, about whether or not English Canada answered the call, but French Canada did not. Can you weigh in on that? What percentage of the soldiers fighting in Ypres would have been from Quebec, for example?
In Ypres, it's a special situation because more than 2/3 of the 1st Canadian Division was of British descent. So most of the men came from not only English Canada, but Britain, or some of them had just moved to Canada in the year previous to the war. So it was a situation where most of the Canadians there were Anglophones, but there were also Francophones who joined in 1914 for sure.
Because there's this sense, Alan, and you can tell us whether this is sort of, real history or just sort of hearsay over the years. There's this sense that people in Quebec were saying, why should we go fight for the King's War? We have nothing to do with this. True or false?
No historian ever answers the question. But I think there's a couple of points here. First of all, one of the important points with what we were talking about earlier was to show that the Canadians were not just there as good colonial cannon fodder answering the call of the mother country. They were fighting for civilization, and they perceived it that way. And that's the way the war was presented. Yes, of course, the empire was threatened, but what was the empire? The empire embodied civilization. It embodied freedom. When you fought for the empire, you were fighting for those things. So the Canadians made very clear from the start that they were fighting for Canada, and also for the empire, and also for civilization. The low enlistment rate in French Canada has a number of causes. It's something we can't really deal with right here. But one of the problems, of course, with war as crusade is that it very quickly morphs into intolerance. Intolerance of people who haven't signed up. Intolerance of French Canadians who are perceived as being not fully committed to the war effort. Intolerance of those who are born in enemy alien countries and are settlers in the Canadian West. Ultimately, criticism of farmers who were previously the heroes. They were raising the food to feed the empire, but when they resisted sending their sons off to war and when they wanted higher prices for their crops, all of a sudden intolerance to profiteers, intolerance to labor unions who want more money for the work they're doing. And by the end of the war, the effect of this is that there's a tremendous combination of hope, expectation, fear, and intolerance that's built up in Canadian society, which will lead to explosions after the war.
Explosions like what?
Like the Winnipeg General Strike, like the Progressive Party, like tremendous upheaval in churches, you name it, sort of prohibition across the boards. The war changes everything in that respect.
You wanted to add?
Yes, about the Anglophone and Francophone view of the conscription, I think it's important to say that, yes, it was very out there during the war. It was everywhere in the newspapers, but I think it also masked a wider sentiment in 1916, 1917, in Anglo-Canada, that the men who wanted to go by that time were gone. And when conscription was finally adopted in the summer of 1917, when the first men were called, 93% of the men across Canada were called, asked for an exemption. So that's across the country.
Not just Francophones.
Not just Francophones. So I think it gives us same sentiment all the time.
Interesting. I want to ask you both about what might be the greatest poem ever written during wartime, which emerges from this battle in Belgium 100 years ago next week. In Flanders Field, John McCrae, Lieutenant Colonel. What do you like about the poem?
Well, it's interesting the way the poem has evolved. The first two stanzas of this poem are very conventional, sort of Victorian poetry. He talks about crosses, but he doesn't mention killing and bodies and so on. He talks about the dead, but in the language of sacrifice. It's very conventional. It's the third stanza that's arresting.
Before you get to that, we should just remind everybody, this is, you know, in Flanders Field,
The poppies
blow.
blow
Okay.
between the crosses, row on row that mark our graves, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly.
Good for you. How much can you
Scarce
do the
heard
whole
of
thing by
guts
heart?
below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. But it's the third stanza. Now this poem is written on the battlefield. It's published in December 1915, so it's a little later, but it very well expresses the view. The last stanza, take up our quarrel with the foe. To you with failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. Now, today we listen to that, we hear it every Remembrance Day, and we think of it in fairly abstract terms. At the time, it was a clarion call to answer the sacrifice of these men who had given so much. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep. Those are powerful words.
That's not
in the middle of the
pacifism
war.
there, is it?
Not at all.
Although it's kind of, would you say it's taken on that connotation over the years?
Well, I mean, the torch, obviously the war is over, so we interpret that torch in a different way today. And I think that's what gives the poem its continuing relevance. That torch can be the torch of lasting peace. It can be the torch of development, of brotherhood, or whatever. But it was not seen that way in 1915.
What do you think of the poem?
I agree that it became popular very quickly during the war with the soldiers, with the civilians. It was used on recruitment posters. It was used to raise money for the war. But early in the 1920s, it became closely associated to the poppies and to remembrance. So I think that the significance evolved, and maybe now we're more closely associated to remembrance because of the poppies.
I'm not a Montreal Canadiens hockey fan, but if I'm not mistaken, isn't there a line from that poem in the Canadiens dressing room, the line about the passing of the torch?
Absolutely.
I think there is.
I don't know, I'm an Ottawa Senators hockey fan.
Oh, good for you. You're having some fun this year, unlike the rest of us who are Leaf fans. Do you have any objection to the fact that a poem which is meant to discuss a time when tens of thousands of Canadians died is being referred to as in go out there and score some goals for the home team?
Because I'm a Habs fan,
Oh,
I
you
have
don't
to
mind.
say no, because
Okay.
it's so powerful
Yes.
of a line that I think it, and Canada, in hockey is so important for Canada.
Okay. That's not a bad answer, actually. Very good. There are other remembrances of Ypres that are currently at the Canadian War Museum, and I want you to tell us about a painting by Richard Jack. What do you like about that one, Alan?
Our friend Max Aiken, now Lord Beaverbrook, one of the things he does with the Canadian War Records Office is he sets up a program of artists to portray the war. Because, again, there's very little photography, very little motion picture, and so on. Most of these artists are British, but under pressure he adds some Canadians, including A.Y. Jackson and Frederick Varley. And in January 1919, there's a display in London of the paintings. There's some modernism, there's a lot of traditionalism, but the painting, there's two objects actually that attract the most attention. One is a painting by Richard Jack, which is a depiction of the Canadians at the Second Battle of Ypres. Jack is a British portrait painter, never went near the battlefield. There's nothing about that painting that remotely resembles what the battle was really like. Heroic Canadian leading the men on and all that stuff.
It's all out of his imagination.
It's out of his imagination, but it was the most popular painting, not only in Britain, but when they showed these paintings in Canada, it was the one that Canadians responded to. It's what people wanted to believe about that battle.
Let me ask you about a painting by Alfred Bastien. You prefer that one?
Alfred Bastien is one of my favorite painters, but I agree that Richard Jack's painting is very powerful because cameras were not allowed at that time. So there are very few pictures of the Second Battle of Ypres. So it's still important to have some sort of visual that you can associate to, and even if it's just to talk about the battle, even if it's not necessarily, doesn't necessarily represent what it was like. But I think that in Bastien's case, we're talking about a painting in Passchendaele, so it's close to the Ypres area, but it also shows that we had to fight and to hold this territory for over 3 years, and the appalling conditions that the soldiers were fighting in. By that time, it was a sea of mud. It was rotten bodies. There are still over 7,000 Canadian bodies in the soil in this area today because it was just constant fighting and horrific conditions. So I think that in that sense, Bastien reflects these, illustrates these appalling conditions.
We've got a minute left here, which is about enough time for me to say, and this was going to be the war that ended all wars, right? And the world was back at war as a world 2 decades later. What the heck happened?
Well, I think it was going to be the war to end all wars because after 4 years of sacrifice and slaughter, that's what people had to believe. And in the final chapter, I guess, of the Remembrance of Ypres is the perhaps haven't time to show it, but the statue of the brooding soldier that was erected on the battlefield. And that's light years different from the depiction even only a couple of years earlier. Now the soldier is looking out with brooding melancholy on the tragedy of the past and the challenges of the future. And there is in his face so much expression of those times. And the poppy, of course, by 1925 is the symbol. And so glorious war and crusade has translated into remembrance. And the only way this can have meaning at all is if this was the war to end wars.
Well, this is the discussion to end all discussions. Thank you very much for your participation today, you two. Alan, there's Mélanie Morin-Pelletier from the Canadian War Museum, Fighting in Flanders, Gas Mud Memory. And Alan Boker, A Time Such As There Never Was Before, Canada After the Great War. Thanks, you two.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.